Lorraine Hadley woke up on a Tuesday morning in late October to the sound of a heart monitor and the smell of disinfectant so strong it burned the back of her throat. The fluorescent light above her bed flickered with a faint electrical hum. Her mouth was dry. Her chest ached in a way that felt deeper than muscle, deeper than bone, like something fundamental inside her had been cracked open and stitched back together while she slept. She blinked at the ceiling tiles and tried to remember how she got here. Fragments came back slowly. The kitchen floor. The phone ringing. A crushing pressure in her chest that dropped her to her knees beside the stove where a pot of soup had just started to boil. Then nothing. 41 days of nothing. A nurse appeared beside the bed, a young woman with kind eyes and a lanyard that read St. Francis Regional Medical Center, Wichita, Kansas. She touched Lorraine's hand gently. "Welcome back, Mrs. Hadley. You gave us quite a scare." Lorraine tried to speak, but her voice came out as a dry whisper. "How long?" The nurse adjusted the foredrip. 41 days. You had a massive cardiac event. Surgery, complications, a second procedure. But you're here. You made it." Lorraine closed her eyes. 41 days. 6 weeks of her life simply erased, and no one had bothered to sit in the chair beside her bed. No flowers on the windowsill. No cards taped to the wall. Just the beeping monitor and the slow drip of saline into her veins. She was 73 years old. She had raised 3 children in a 4-bedroom house on Maple Ridge Drive in Wichita, a house she and her late husband Donald had bought in 1986 with a 30-year mortgage they paid off together, dollar by dollar, year by year. Donald had passed 7 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the way people always say they hope to go. After that, Lorraine lived alone in the house with a gray tabby cat named Pearl and the kind of silence that fills a home when the person who made it feel alive is gone. Her children were grown. Mitchell, the oldest at 49, worked in commercial real estate in Kansas City. Brenda, 45, managed a dental practice in Overland Park. And the youngest, Craig, 41, lived 40 minutes away in Wichita but might as well have lived on another continent for how often he visited. They called on holidays. Sometimes birthdays. They had their own lives, their own mortgages, their own problems. Lorraine understood that. She had never been the kind of mother who demanded attention. She kept the garden. She fed the cat. She read library books on the porch and watched the seasons change through the same kitchen window where she had once watched her children play in the backyard. What she did not know, what she could not have known while unconscious on a ventilator for 41 days, was that her children had been busy. The social worker arrived on the 3rd day after Lorraine regained consciousness. Her name was Diana Marsh, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose and a folder thick enough to make Lorraine's stomach tighten before a single word was spoken. Diana pulled a chair close to the bed and opened the folder slowly, the way someone opens an envelope they already know contains bad news. "Mrs. Hadley, I need to walk you through some developments that occurred while you were in the ICU." Lorraine's hands gripped the blanket. "What developments?" Diana removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Your son Mitchell activated a durable power of attorney 4 days after your hospitalization. He filed it as an emergency measure, citing your incapacitation and the need to manage your financial obligations during recovery." Lorraine stared at her. "I never signed a power of attorney." Diana paused carefully. "The document on file bears your signature. It was notarized 11 months ago." Lorraine shook her head slowly. "I never signed anything like that." She could feel her pulse rising, the monitor beside her beginning to beep faster. Diana placed a hand gently on her arm. "I understand this is difficult. Please try to stay calm. But there's more." More turned out to be everything. Mitchell had liquidated the savings account Lorraine and Donald had built over 4 decades. $47,000, withdrawn in 3 transactions over 2 weeks. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been listed, sold, and closed in 39 days to a developer who paid 12% below market value for a fast cash deal. Brenda had removed the contents of the house, furniture, appliances, clothing, photographs, and divided them among the three siblings before the sale was finalized. Craig had sold Donald's truck, a 2011 Ford F-150 that Lorraine had kept in the garage because it still smelled like him. He got $4,000 for it. The title transfer was processed while Lorraine was on a ventilator. They had divided everything. Every dish, every quilt, every framed photograph on the mantel. The wedding china Lorraine's mother had given her. The rocking chair Donald built by hand the year Mitchell was born. The jewelry box on her dresser that held her grandmother's opal ring and a locket with a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. Everything. Diana closed the folder quietly. Mrs. Hadley, I want you to know that we are looking into the legality of the power of attorney. But the transactions have already been completed. The house is sold. The accounts are closed. Your children have indicated that they acted in your best interest, given the medical expenses and uncertainty about your recovery. Lorraine didn't cry. She sat very still, her hands folded on the blanket, and stared at the far wall of the hospital room where a small watercolor painting of a Kansas wheat field hung slightly crooked in its frame. She stared at it for a long time. After a moment, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but steady. Pearl. My cat. Where is Pearl? Diana hesitated. I don't have information about a pet, Mrs. Hadley. I can make some calls. Lorraine nodded once and turned her face toward the window. Outside, the October sky was flat and gray, the kind of sky that promised nothing. Diana did make those calls. 2 days later, she returned to Lorraine's room with an answer that settled in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Craig's wife had taken Pearl to the county shelter the week after Lorraine was admitted. She told the intake volunteer that the cat was a stray, that no one was coming back for it. The shelter held animals for 14 days before making disposition decisions. By the time Diana traced the paperwork, Pearl had been transferred to a rescue organization in Hutchinson that placed older cats with foster families. Diana had a phone number but no guarantee. Lorraine wrote the number on the back of her library card with a pen the nurse lent her. She held the card in her hand for a long time after Diana left. A stray, she whispered. They told them she was a stray. That night, for the first time since waking up, Lorraine allowed herself to cry. Not for the house or the money or the china or the ring. For a 12-year-old gray tabby cat who had slept on her pillow every night for a decade and had been handed to strangers and called nobodies. It took 3 more weeks for Lorraine to be discharged. During that time, none of her children visited. Mitchell sent a text message through the hospital's patient communication system. It read, Mom, glad you're recovering. We made the best decisions we could under the circumstances. The house needed to sell. Call when you're settled. Brenda sent flowers once, a generic arrangement from a delivery service. The card read, thinking of you. Craig sent nothing. On the day Lorraine was wheeled to the hospital entrance in a wheelchair she didn't need but hospital policy required, she carried a plastic bag containing the clothes she had been wearing when the ambulance brought her in 6 weeks earlier. A cotton blouse. A pair of gray slacks. Slip-on shoes. Her purse, which contained $11, a library card, a photograph of Donald, and a key ring with no house to open. Diana Marsh met her at the curb. She handed Lorraine a thin envelope. There is one more thing from your father's estate that was never transferred or included in any of the recent transactions. Lorraine frowned. My father's estate was settled 30 years ago. Diana nodded. The house and the primary acreage, yes. But there's a separate parcel. 47 acres about 2 hours west of here, near a place called Harmon Creek. It was never developed. Never appraised in the estate division. Your father apparently kept it off the books, registered under a different entity. It transferred to you automatically upon his death through a survivorship clause that your siblings either didn't know about or didn't contest. Lorraine opened the envelope. Inside was a county assessor's record, a faded property map, and a handwritten note on brittle paper. The note was in her father's handwriting, a tight, careful script she would have recognized anywhere. It read, "For Lorraine. When you need it most." She held the note for a long time, standing on the sidewalk outside the hospital in clothes that no longer fit properly, with $11 in her purse and nowhere else to go. Diana offered to arrange temporary housing. Lorraine shook her head. "Can someone drive me to Harmon Creek?" Diana studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Hadley, the property records indicate the land hasn't been maintained in decades. There's a structure listed, but it may not be habitable." Lorraine folded the note carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "My father left it for me. He didn't leave things without reason." A hospital volunteer named Marcus, a retired schoolteacher who drove patients home on Tuesdays and Thursdays, agreed to take her. The drive west from Wichita stretched through miles of flat prairie interrupted only by grain elevators, barbed wire fences, and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees marking a creek bed. Lorraine sat in the passenger seat with the envelope on her lap and watched the landscape open wider and wider as the city fell away behind them. Marcus made polite conversation for the first half hour, then seemed to sense that Lorraine preferred silence. The radio played low, an oldie station drifting in and out of static. Somewhere past Pratt, the road narrowed from divided highway to two-lane blacktop. The towns grew smaller. The distances between them grew longer. The sky took on that enormous western Kansas quality where the horizon seemed to curve with the earth itself. They turned off the county road onto a dirt track that the GPS couldn't find. Lorraine guided Marcus from memory, or maybe from instinct. She hadn't been to this land since she was a girl, but something about the shape of the hills felt familiar. The way the ground rose and fell like a sleeping body beneath a blanket of dry grass. The property announced itself with a wooden post driven into the ground at the edge of the track. No sign, no mailbox, just a post with a rusted iron ring bolted to its side, the kind of ring you'd tie a horse to. Beyond it, the land opened into a shallow valley ringed by low limestone bluffs. Tall grass covered everything, golden brown in the autumn light, waving gently in a wind that hadn't stopped blowing since they left the highway. The structure Diana had mentioned sat at the far end of the valley. A stone farmhouse, small, square, built from the same pale limestone as the bluffs. Its roof was corrugated metal, rusted orange in patches but still intact. The windows were dark and curtainless. A wooden door hung slightly ajar, warped by decades of weather but still on its hinges. Behind the house stood a smaller outbuilding, a root cellar or storage shed, half buried in the hillside with a heavy wooden door facing south. Marcus pulled the car to a stop and looked at the property with an expression that was trying very hard not to be pity. "You sure about this, Mrs. Hadley?" Lorraine opened the car door. The wind hit her immediately, cold and clean, carrying the smell of sage and dry earth. She stepped out and stood for a moment, looking at the valley, the house, the enormous sky. "Yes," she said quietly. "This is it." Marcus helped her carry the plastic bag to the front door. He offered to stay, to help her check the house, to drive her back if it wasn't safe. Lorraine thanked him and told him she would be fine. He left his phone number on a scrap of paper, shook her hand gently, and drove away down the dirt track. The sound of his engine faded slowly until there was nothing left but the wind and the grass and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere above the bluffs. Lorraine pushed the front door open. It scraped across a stone floor, and the interior exhaled a breath of stale air that smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly sweet, dried wildflowers maybe, or the ghost of whatever herb her father had hung from the rafters decades ago. The house was a single large room divided by a half wall into a living space and a kitchen. A cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner, its pipe rising through the ceiling. A wooden table with 2 chairs stood near the window. The kitchen had a hand pump connected to a well line, a propane stove with a small tank, and open shelving stacked with canning jars, most of them empty, a few still sealed with contents that had long since turned dark and unidentifiable. A narrow staircase led to a loft that held a mattress on a wooden frame, a wool blanket folded at its foot, and a kerosene lantern on a shelf beside a box of matches. It was sparse. It was cold. It was shelter. Lorraine set her bag on the table and looked around the room. Standing there, she felt something loosen in her memory. She had been here before. Not in a dream, not in imagination, but physically, decades ago, when she was small enough that her father could lift her onto his shoulders without effort. She remembered fragments now, the way you remember a song you haven't heard since childhood, not the words but the feeling underneath them. A summer afternoon. The smell of limestone dust and wildflowers. Her father kneeling beside a rock outcrop on the bluff, turning a pale blue crystal in his hand and holding it up so the sunlight passed through it. She remembered asking him what it was and him saying, "Something the earth has been making for a very long time." She remembered sleeping on this same floor, on a bedroll her father had laid out beside the wood stove, listening to him write in a notebook by lantern light, the scratch of his pen the only sound in the valley. She must have been 6, maybe 7. He brought her here once and never brought her again. At the time she thought it was because the drive was long and the house had no television and there was nothing for a child to do. Now, standing in the same room 47 years later with nothing left to her name, she understood differently. He had shown her this place once so she would remember it existed. And then he had kept her away so no one would ever connect her to it until the moment she needed it most. Her father, Earl Macklin, had been a quiet man. A geologist by training, a farmer by necessity, a man who believed that the earth kept its own records and that patience was the only tool worth carrying. He had worked for the State Geological Survey in the 60s and 70s before retiring to his farm outside Wichita. He died in 1994, when Lorraine was 41, leaving her the farmhouse and the land that her siblings had divided among themselves. This parcel, these 47 acres near Harmon Creek, had never come up. Not in the will reading. Not in the family arguments about who got what. It existed outside the inventory of Earl Macklin's life, as if he had carved this piece of earth out of the official record and set it aside for a purpose no one else was meant to understand. Lorraine ran her hand along the stone wall. The limestone was cool and rough under her fingers. She could feel the age of it, the weight of the years pressed into every joint and surface. Her father had built this house with his own hands. She knew that the way you know things about your parents that were never spoken aloud but were simply understood. The precision of the stonework. The careful angles of the roof. The way the door frame was cut to accommodate the prevailing wind so the door wouldn't slam in a storm. She walked to the hand pump and worked the handle. It took nearly a minute of priming before water coughed and sputtered from the spout, rust-colored at first, then gradually clearing to something that looked drinkable. She cupped her hands beneath the flow and drank. The water was cold and tasted of iron and deep earth. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the bluffs, casting the valley in long blue shadows. Lorraine found matches beside the wood stove and opened the firebox. Kindling had been stacked inside, dry and ready, as if someone had prepared it years ago knowing that one day it would need to burn. She struck a match. The kindling caught immediately, crackling and popping, filling the room with warmth and the sharp, resinous smell of cedar. She sat in one of the wooden chairs and watched the fire through the stove's glass door. The room slowly warmed around her. For the first time in 41 days of unconsciousness, 3 weeks of hospital recovery, and the slow devastating revelation that her own children had dismantled her life while she lay dying, Lorraine Hadley felt something that wasn't grief or anger or exhaustion. She felt the house holding her. Not in a sentimental way. Not in the way people talk about houses in greeting cards. In a structural way. The walls were thick. The roof was sound. The fire was burning. The water ran. Her father had built this place to last, and it had lasted, and now it was doing what it was built to do. That first night, Lorraine climbed the narrow stairs to the loft and lay down on the mattress beneath the wool blanket. The wind moved across the metal roof in long, steady waves. The kerosene lantern threw soft amber light across the wooden beams. Through the small window above the bed, she could see a sky so thick with stars it looked like the universe had spilled something luminous across the dark. She thought about Pearl, her gray tabby, and wondered where she was. She thought about the rocking chair Donald had built and which of her children was sitting in it now. She thought about the opal ring and the locket and the wedding china and the $47,000 and the house on Maple Ridge Drive where she had spent 37 years of her life. Then she closed her eyes and let the wind carry all of it away, just for one night. In the morning, she would begin. Dawn arrived cold and pale, the kind of Kansas morning where frost laces the grass and your breath hangs visible in the air. Lorraine woke stiff and sore, her body reminding her of the surgery, the weeks of immobility, the 73 years of living that had accumulated in her joints and muscles. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence, then slowly swung her legs over the side of the mattress and stood. The wood stove had burned down to coals overnight. She rebuilt the fire methodically, the way her father had taught her when she was a girl, crumpling newspaper she found in a box near the stove, stacking kindling in a loose pyramid, feeding larger pieces once the flame took hold. By the time the room was warm, she had made a decision. She would not call her children. She would not beg. She would not explain or plead or ask for what was already taken. Whatever this place was, whatever her father had intended by leaving it to her, she would find out on her own. The first days were the hardest. Lorraine had no car, no phone, and no neighbors within visible distance. The nearest town was Harmon Creek, a settlement of maybe 300 people about 4 miles east along the county road. She walked there on her second morning, wrapped in the wool blanket from the loft because she had no proper coat. The town consisted of a gas station, a feed store, a post office that doubled as a notary, and a small grocery called Gwen's Market that sold canned goods, bread, milk, and not much else. Lorraine bought what she could afford with the $11 in her purse. 2 cans of soup, a loaf of bread, a box of matches, and a small bag of dry cat food, because hope is a strange and stubborn thing. The woman behind the counter studied her with frank curiosity. "You the one staying out at the Macklin place?" Lorraine nodded. "I'm Earl's daughter." The woman's expression shifted. Something between surprise and recognition moved across her weathered face. "Earl Macklin. Well. Haven't heard that name in a while." She extended a rough hand across the counter. "I'm Gwen Coulter. Your daddy used to come in here every couple of weeks for supplies. Quiet man. Always bought the same things. Canned peaches, kerosene, and a newspaper." Lorraine almost smiled. "That sounds like him." Gwen leaned on the counter. "That place has been shut up for years. People around here figured it was abandoned. Nobody goes out to that valley much. Too far off the main road, and the terrain gets rough past the bluffs." She paused. "You planning to stay?" Lorraine picked up her bag of groceries. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Gwen studied her a moment longer, then disappeared into the back room. She returned with a heavy canvas coat, faded green with flannel lining. "My husband's. He passed 4 years ago. It's been hanging on that hook doing nobody any good." "Take it." Lorraine hesitated. Gwen pushed the coat across the counter. "Take it," she repeated firmly. "It's cold out there and that blanket won't last you past November." The walk back to the property took over an hour. Lorraine wore the canvas coat and carried the groceries in a paper bag pressed against her chest. The wind pushed steadily from the northwest, sharp and insistent, but the coat cut it well enough. When she reached the valley, the late afternoon sun had turned the limestone bluffs the color of old honey. She stopped at the edge of the property and looked at the house, the outbuilding behind it, and the wide sweep of land stretching in every direction. 47 acres. Her father's secret parcel. The one piece of her life that her children had not known about, had not touched, had not divided among themselves like a carcass being picked clean. And somewhere on this land, something else her father had left behind. Because as Lorraine walked toward the house that evening, she noticed something she hadn't seen the day before. Behind the outbuilding, partially hidden by a thicket of dead sumac and wild plum, a circle of old stones rose about 3 feet above the ground. A heavy iron cap sat over the top, bolted in place and sealed with concrete that had cracked but not broken over the decades. A well. Lorraine stood before it in the fading light, her hand resting on the cold iron cap. The concrete seal was marked with a single date, scratched into the surface with what looked like a nail or a chisel. The year Lorraine turned 18. The year she left home for college. The year her father had sealed this well shut and never mentioned it to anyone. She stood there until the stars came out, her fingers tracing the numbers, and wondered what her father had buried beneath the only water source on 47 acres of Kansas prairie. Lorraine did not touch the well the next day or the day after that. She had more immediate problems. The propane tank connected to the kitchen stove was nearly empty. The hand pump needed a new gasket, and every third stroke sent water spraying sideways across the counter instead of down into the basin. The loft window had a crack that let in a draft sharp enough to wake her at 3 in the morning, shivering beneath the wool blanket that was starting to smell like wood smoke and age. She worked on the house the way her father had taught her to work on anything. One task at a time. No rushing. No shortcuts. She found tools in the outbuilding, rusted but functional, a claw hammer, a set of wrenches, a handsaw, rolls of baling wire, and a coffee can full of assorted nails and screws that Earl Macklin had apparently saved over the course of decades. Lorraine replaced the pump gasket with a strip of rubber cut from an old inner tube she found hanging on a nail. She patched the loft window with a piece of thick plastic sheeting and duct tape from the same coffee can. She walked to Harmon Creek twice that first week, once for groceries and once to ask Gwen Coulter if anyone in town sold propane. Gwen made a phone call. By the following afternoon, a man named Dale Puckett arrived in a battered white truck with a replacement tank strapped in the bed. He was in his 60s, wiry and sunburned, the kind of man who had spent his entire life within 30 miles of where he was born. He swapped the tanks without saying much, then stood on the porch and looked out at the valley. "Your daddy was a particular kind of man," he said after a while. Lorraine wiped her hands on the canvas coat. "Particular how?" Dale squinted toward the bluffs. "Kept to himself mostly. But he knew this land better than anyone. Used to walk the whole property, every ridge, every draw, every rock formation. Had notebooks full of observations. Geological stuff." He glanced at her. "You know he worked for the state survey?" Lorraine nodded. "Before I was born and for a while after." Dale shifted his weight. "There was talk, years back, that he found something out here. Something in the rock. Nobody ever knew for sure because Earl never said a word about it. But there were people who came around asking questions. Company people. Suits." Lorraine felt something tighten in her chest. "What kind of company?" Dale shrugged. "Don't remember the name. Mineral rights outfit, I think. Came through in the early 70s, tried to buy up land all through this part of the county. Your daddy told them to get off his property. That was the end of it, far as I know." He tipped his hat and walked back to the truck. "You need anything else, Mrs. Hadley, Gwen knows how to reach me." Lorraine watched him drive away, then turned and looked toward the back of the property where the sealed well sat hidden behind the dead sumac. 1971. The same year the company people came asking questions. The same year her father sealed the well. She didn't go to it yet. Not because she wasn't curious but because something in her understood that whatever was down there had waited 55 years. It could wait a few more days while she learned how to survive. November settled over the valley like a gray wool blanket pulled tight across the sky. The mornings came colder, the frost thicker, the daylight shorter. Lorraine fell into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like conversation with the land. She woke before dawn, rebuilt the fire, pumped water, ate whatever she had, and then worked. She cleared brush around the house. She patched the outbuilding door. She split firewood from a dead cottonwood that had fallen across the property line, dragging the rounds back to the house on a makeshift sled built from a sheet of old corrugated roofing and baling wire. Her body protested every task. The surgery scar across her sternum ached when she lifted anything heavier than a bucket of water. Her knee swelled after long walks to town. Some mornings she stood at the bottom of the loft stairs and had to talk herself into climbing them one step at a time. She was 73 years old, recovering from open-heart surgery, living alone on 47 acres of empty prairie with no car, no phone, and $11 that had long since been spent. But she did not quit. She did not call Mitchell or Brenda or Craig. She did not sit down and weep, though there were nights when the wind howled across the metal roof and the fire burned low and the loneliness pressed against her chest harder than any cardiac event ever had. On a Tuesday afternoon during the second week, she nearly did quit. She had been dragging a section of dead cottonwood across the frozen ground when her boot caught a root hidden beneath the grass. She went down hard, landing on her left side, the impact sending a sharp white bolt of pain through her sternum. She lay there in the dirt, staring at the sky, breathing in shallow gasps, waiting for the pain to either pass or finish her. The wind moved through the dry grass around her. A hawk circled overhead, indifferent. For several minutes she did not move. She thought about the hospital bed and the warm saline drip and the small watercolor of the wheat field hanging crooked on the wall. She thought about how easy it would be to simply lie here and let someone find her eventually, the way they had found her on the kitchen floor beside the stove. Then she thought about her father, driving out to this valley alone for decades, building a house from stone, carving a chamber from bedrock, preserving something precious in glass jars and filing cabinets while the world above forgot he existed. If Earl Macklin could do that at 70, she could stand up at 73. She rolled to her hands and knees, waited for the dizziness to clear, and pulled herself upright using the trunk of the fallen tree. She left the firewood where it lay and walked back to the house slowly, one hand pressed against her sternum, the other gripping the canvas coat as if it were the only thing holding her together. She made it to the wood stove, fed the fire, and sat in the chair until her breathing steadied. She did not quit. On those nights, she talked to Donald. Not out loud, not like a crazy woman muttering to ghosts, but inside, in the quiet space where 38 years of marriage had built a room that death could not demolish. She told him about the valley. About the frost on the limestone. About Gwen Coulter and the canvas coat and the hand pump that still sprayed sideways every fifth stroke no matter how tightly she cinched the gasket. She told him about the well. "I think Daddy left something down there," she said one night, lying in the loft with the lantern burning low. "Something he didn't want anyone else to find." She paused. "Something he wanted me to find." The wind answered with a long, low moan across the bluffs. 3 weeks after her arrival, Lorraine made her first real attempt to examine the well. She had spent those weeks circling it at a distance, studying it the way her father might have studied a rock formation, observing before touching, learning the shape of the thing before trying to open it. The well was built from hand-cut limestone blocks, the same stone as the house, stacked in a circle about 4 feet in diameter and rising 3 feet above the ground. The iron cap on top was a single heavy disc, maybe an inch thick, bolted to a metal ring set into the stone with 4 large hex bolts. The concrete seal filled the gaps between the cap and the stone, cracked in places but still solid enough to resist casual tampering. Lorraine ran her hand across the surface of the cap. Rust flaked off beneath her fingers. The bolts were corroded almost smooth, the hex heads barely visible beneath decades of oxidation. She tried one with the largest wrench from the outbuilding. It didn't move. Not even slightly. She tried again the next day with a length of pipe slipped over the wrench handle for leverage. The first bolt shrieked and snapped clean off. The second held, then slowly, reluctantly, began to turn. It took her the better part of 2 hours to remove 3 of the 4 bolts. The fourth was seized so completely that no amount of leverage could break it free. Lorraine sat on the ground beside the well, breathing hard, her hands raw and trembling. The surgery scar throbbed. Her shoulders burned. She looked at the cap, 3 bolts removed and 1 still holding, and felt the familiar weight of almost settling over her. Almost there. Almost open. Almost free. The story of her whole life told in that single stubborn bolt. She walked to town the next morning and found Dale Puckett at the feed store. He listened to her problem, nodded once, and drove out to the property that afternoon with an acetylene torch in the back of his truck. He didn't ask what was in the well. He didn't ask why it was sealed. He cut through the last bolt in 40 seconds, the metal glowing orange and dropping away in a shower of sparks, and then helped Lorraine lever the iron cap off the top of the stone circle. It took both of them to move it. The cap was heavier than it looked, and when it finally slid free and fell into the grass with a dull thud, a rush of cool air rose from the opening like the earth exhaling a breath it had held for 55 years. Dale looked down into the darkness. "Deep," he said. Lorraine leaned over the edge. The well shaft dropped straight down, lined with the same hand-cut limestone, disappearing into shadow. But it wasn't a water well. Not anymore. About 15 feet down, the shaft widened into what looked like a chamber carved into the bedrock. She could see the top of a wooden ladder bolted to the wall, its rungs dark with age but still in place. Dale glanced at her. "You going down there?" Lorraine looked at the ladder, then at her hands, still raw from the wrench work. "Not today. But soon." Dale nodded. He didn't offer to go down himself, and she appreciated that. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that whatever was at the bottom of that well was meant for her. He drove away with a wave and a promise to check on her in a few days. That night, Lorraine sat beside the open well and dropped a small stone into the darkness. She counted. 1 second. 2 seconds. A faint clatter echoed up from below, the sound of stone hitting stone, not water. The well was dry. Whatever her father had sealed down there was not submerged. It was waiting on solid ground. She slept fitfully, dreaming of her father's hands, rough and precise, fitting stones together without mortar, building things that would outlast him by decades. In the morning, she prepared carefully. She tied a rope to the iron ring set into the well stones and tested it with her full weight. She wrapped the old flashlight from the outbuilding in a dish towel and tucked it into the canvas coat. She ate a full meal, the last can of soup and half a loaf of bread, because she did not know how long she would be down there, and she had learned enough about her own body to know that 73-year-old women recovering from heart surgery did not get second chances with ladders. The descent was slow. Each rung of the wooden ladder groaned under her weight but held. The air grew cooler as she climbed down, carrying that sharp mineral scent she remembered from childhood trips to limestone caves with her father. The walls of the shaft were smooth, hand-finished, the chisel marks still visible in the beam of the flashlight. Her father had carved this space himself. She was certain of it. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a chamber roughly 10 feet across and 8 feet high, cut directly into the limestone bedrock. Lorraine stepped off the last rung and onto solid rock. She swung the flashlight slowly across the space. The first thing she saw was the shelving. Wooden planks set on metal brackets, lining 3 walls of the chamber from floor to ceiling. On the shelves sat rows of glass specimen jars, dozens of them, each one sealed and labeled in her father's neat handwriting. The jars contained rock samples, mineral crystals, soil cores, and dried plant specimens pressed between glass slides. Some of the crystals caught the flashlight beam and threw tiny prismatic reflections across the stone walls, like the chamber was breathing color. The second thing she saw was the filing cabinet. A heavy steel 2-drawer unit sat against the far wall, its surface coated with a thin layer of dust but otherwise intact. The drawers were not locked. The third thing she saw was the desk. A small wooden writing desk, the kind her father had always preferred, sturdy and plain, was pushed into the corner. On its surface sat a leather-bound journal, a magnifying glass, a set of geological survey maps rolled and bound with twine, and a sealed envelope with a single word written on the front. Lorraine. She stood in the center of the chamber for a long moment, the flashlight beam resting on that envelope, her own name staring back at her from across 55 years of silence. Her hand shook as she picked it up. The paper was brittle but intact, preserved by the cool, dry air of the underground chamber. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakably her father's, steady and measured, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who thought before he wrote and meant every word he set down. Dear Lorraine. I am writing this in the summer of 1971. You have just left for college, and I am proud of you in ways I have never been able to say properly. I have spent the last 6 years studying the geological formations beneath this property, and I have found something extraordinary. The limestone bedrock in this valley sits above a deposit of high-purity celestite crystals, a strontium sulfate mineral used in electronics, pyrotechnics, and specialized medical applications. The deposit is extensive. Based on my surveys, it runs beneath at least 30 of the 47 acres and extends to a depth I have not been able to fully measure. Lorraine lowered the letter for a moment. Her breath was shallow, her pulse loud in her ears. She continued reading. In 1970, a mineral exploration company approached me with an offer to purchase the land. When I refused, they returned with a surveyor and attempted to file an eminent domain claim based on a fraudulent agricultural assessment. I fought it and won, but I understood then that the deposit would attract attention I could not control. So I sealed the well, removed the property from all public survey records I had access to, and resolved to keep the discovery hidden until it could be revealed safely. I have documented everything. The specimen jars on these shelves contain core samples from every section of the deposit. The filing cabinet holds my complete survey data, geological maps, assay results from an independent laboratory in Denver, and legal correspondence related to the eminent domain attempt. The journal on this desk contains 10 years of observations, measurements, and analysis. Lorraine turned to the last page. I do not know when you will read this. I do not know what your life will look like when you do. But I know this. You are the only person I trust to decide what happens next. This land is yours. What lies beneath it is yours. Do not let anyone take it from you the way they tried to take it from me. Be patient. Be careful. And know that everything I did so that you would have something no one could take away. Your father, Earl. Lorraine sank down onto the stone floor of the chamber, the letter pressed against her chest, and wept. Not from grief, though grief was there. Not from anger, though anger still burned beneath the surface of every quiet moment. She wept because her father, a man she had loved but never fully understood, had spent the last decades of his life building a fortress beneath the earth and filling it with proof that his daughter would one day need exactly this. She sat there for a long time, in the cool underground dark, surrounded by glass jars and geological maps and the careful, patient work of a man who had seen the future clearly enough to prepare for it. When she finally climbed back up the ladder, the Kansas sky was enormous and blue and indifferent to everything that had just changed. Lorraine spent the next 3 days in the chamber. She descended each morning at first light and climbed back up at dusk, her hands and knees aching, her mind racing. She read every page of the journal. She opened every drawer of the filing cabinet. She examined specimen jars one by one, holding the crystals up to the flashlight and watching them fracture the beam into pale blue and white shards of light. The celestite samples were extraordinary. Even with her limited geological knowledge, Lorraine could see that the crystals were unusually large, unusually pure, and unusually consistent across the full range of core samples. Her father's assay reports, conducted by a laboratory in Denver in 1969 and 1970, confirmed what the visual evidence suggested. The deposit beneath the property was among the highest purity celestite formations ever documented in the continental United States. The filing cabinet held more than geological data. In the bottom drawer, beneath a layer of survey maps, Lorraine found a second envelope. This one was thicker, sealed with wax, and labeled in her father's handwriting. Legal protections. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a mineral rights deed, recorded with the county clerk in 1968, assigning all subsurface mineral rights on the 47-acre parcel exclusively and irrevocably to Lorraine Hadley. The second was a certified appraisal from the Denver laboratory, estimating the commercial value of the celestite deposit at between $14 and $22 million, in 1970 currency. The third was a letter from a mining attorney in Topeka outlining the legal framework for protected mineral extraction and the steps required to bring a deposit to market without surrendering ownership. Lorraine read each document twice. Then she sat at her father's desk, in his chair, in the chamber he had carved from living rock, and did the math she had never been taught to do. $22 million in 1970. Adjusted for 55 years of inflation and the increased demand for strontium compounds in modern electronics and medical imaging technology, the deposit beneath her feet was worth something she could not calculate with certainty but knew with absolute clarity was more than everything her children had taken from her combined. More than the house on Maple Ridge Drive. More than the savings account. More than Donald's truck and the wedding china and the opal ring and every single thing that Mitchell, Brenda, and Craig had divided among themselves while their mother lay unconscious in a hospital bed with tubes in her chest and no one sitting in the chair beside her. Lorraine climbed the ladder one more time that evening and stood beside the open well as the sun set behind the limestone bluffs. The valley was quiet. The wind had settled. The first stars appeared over the eastern horizon like pinpricks in dark fabric. She looked down into the darkness where her father's life work waited, patient and preserved, and she made a decision. She would not hide it. She would not hoard it. She would not use it as a weapon. But she would not let anyone take it from her either. The next morning, Lorraine walked to Harmon Creek and asked Gwen Coulter if she could use the phone behind the counter. Gwen handed it over without question. Lorraine dialed a number she had found in the filing cabinet, written on the mining attorney's letterhead. The firm still existed, now run by the original attorney's daughter, a woman named Catherine Briggs who practiced mineral law out of an office in Topeka. Lorraine explained who she was, whose daughter she was, and what she had found beneath the property near Harmon Creek. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Catherine Briggs said, "Mrs. Hadley, I think you should come to Topeka. And I think you should bring everything your father left you." Catherine Briggs drove out to the property herself 3 days later. She arrived in a silver sedan that looked entirely wrong parked at the end of the dirt track beside the limestone bluffs. She was a tall woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes, practical shoes, and the kind of composure that comes from spending 20 years arguing mineral rights in courtrooms where the other side always had more money. She shook Lorraine's hand at the front door and looked out across the valley for a long moment before saying anything. "My father talked about Earl Macklin exactly once. He said he was the most careful man he had ever represented and that whatever he was protecting out here was worth the silence." Lorraine led her around the back of the house to the open well. Catherine looked down into the shaft, then at Lorraine. "You climbed down that every day for 3 days." Catherine studied her for a moment with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and respect. Then she set down her briefcase and said, "Show me everything." They spent 5 hours underground. Catherine examined the specimen jars, the filing cabinet, the journal, the survey maps, the assay reports, the mineral rights deed, and the legal correspondence, every piece of evidence Earl Macklin had assembled and preserved in a chamber carved from bedrock 55 years ago. She photographed each document with a handheld scanner she had brought in her briefcase. She made notes in a leather-bound legal pad with handwriting nearly as precise as Earl's. When she reached the certified appraisal from the Denver laboratory, she read it twice, set it down, and removed her glasses. "Mrs. Hadley," she said carefully. "Do you understand what you're sitting on?" Lorraine folded her hands in her lap the way she always did when she was trying to hold something steady inside herself. "I understand my father thought it was valuable." Catherine chose her words with the precision of someone who had spent a career in rooms where language could cost millions. The 1970 appraisal estimated the deposit at $14 to $22 million. That was 55 years ago. Strontium sulfate, the mineral your father identified, is now a critical component in the production of ceramic magnets, medical imaging screens, fireworks, and certain types of specialized glass used in electronics manufacturing. Global demand has increased roughly 800% since your father wrote this report. She paused. A conservative modern estimate, pending independent verification, would place the value of this deposit somewhere between $90 and $140 million. Lorraine did not move. She sat in her father's chair, in her father's chamber, and let the number settle over her like weather. Catherine continued. "The mineral rights deed is ironclad. Your father filed it correctly, recorded it with the county, and structured it as an irrevocable personal conveyance. It cannot be challenged by your siblings, your children, or any third party. The property title is clean. The survivorship clause that transferred the parcel to you is legally unambiguous. She closed her legal pad. In short, Mrs. Hadley, everything beneath these 47 acres belongs to you and only you. Lorraine looked at the rows of glass jars on the shelves, the crystals inside them catching the flashlight beam and scattering pale blue light across the stone walls. She thought about the $11 in her purse the day she left the hospital. She thought about the plastic bag of clothes and the wool blanket and the hand pump that still sprayed sideways. Then she thought about her father, standing in this same chamber in 1971, sealing it shut and walking away, trusting that one day his daughter would come back and find what he had built for her. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. Catherine stood and brushed limestone dust from her slacks. "First, we get an independent geological survey team out here to verify the deposit and update the appraisal. I know a firm in Denver that specializes in rare mineral assessments. They're discreet and they're thorough. Second, we file a formal mineral rights confirmation with the state. Third, and this is important, we do not tell anyone what's down here until the legal protections are fully in place." Lorraine nodded. She understood discretion. She had learned it from a man who had kept a fortune hidden beneath a sealed well for half a century. The survey team arrived 11 days later. 3 geologists from the Colorado School of Mines Affiliated Research Group, a private firm that Catherine Briggs had worked with on 2 previous cases. They brought equipment Lorraine could not name: ground-penetrating radar, core drilling apparatus, spectrometric analyzers, and devices that hummed and clicked as they moved systematically across the property. The lead geologist was a woman named Dr. Anwen Marchetti, a compact, focused researcher in her 40s who spoke in measurements and chemical formulas and treated the underground chamber with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. The survey took 4 days. On the 5th day, Dr. Marchetti sat at the wooden table inside the farmhouse, spread a series of printouts across the surface, and delivered her findings. Lorraine sat across from her. Catherine Briggs sat beside her, legal pad open. "The deposit is significantly larger than your father estimated," Dr. Marchetti began. "Based on our radar mapping and core sample analysis, the celestite formation extends beneath approximately 34 of the 47 acres at varying depths between 40 and 120 feet. The crystal purity levels are among the highest we have documented in North America." She slid a printout across the table. "Our preliminary valuation, conservative, places the extractable mineral value at approximately $115 million at current market rates. With optimized extraction and direct-to-manufacturer contracts, that number could approach $150 million. Lorraine looked at the printout. The numbers were printed in clean columns, precise and clinical. $115 million. Sitting beneath the same dry grass and limestone bluffs where she had spent the last 6 weeks splitting firewood and patching windows and learning how to survive on canned soup and borrowed coats. Dr. Marchetti continued. "Your father's documentation is extraordinary, Mrs. Hadley. His survey methodology was rigorous. His sample preservation is textbook. The assay reports from the Denver lab in 1970 are consistent with our modern findings." She paused and looked at Lorraine with an expression that had moved beyond professional interest into something closer to admiration. He could have sold this at any time. He chose to protect it instead. Catherine filed the mineral rights confirmation with the state the following week. The legal framework took another month to finalize: filings, protections, environmental assessments, extraction licensing applications. During that month, Lorraine continued living in the stone farmhouse. She split wood. She walked to town. She sat beside the open well in the evenings and watched the stars appear over the valley, one by one, like someone was turning on lights in a house she could not see. Gwen Coulter noticed the change in her, not in anything Lorraine said, because Lorraine said very little, but in the way she carried herself. The tiredness was still there. The scar from the surgery still ached on cold mornings. But there was something underneath it now, a stillness that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with certainty. You look different, Gwen said one afternoon across the counter. Lorraine almost smiled. I feel different. The news reached her children the way news always reaches people who have stopped paying attention. Brenda heard it first, from a colleague whose husband worked in mineral rights law and had seen the state filing. She called Mitchell. Mitchell called Craig. Within 48 hours, all three of them had independently confirmed what none of them had known, that the mother they had stripped of everything she owned while she lay unconscious in a hospital bed was now sitting on a mineral deposit worth more than $100 million on a piece of land they had never known existed. Mitchell called first. The phone in the farmhouse, a landline Catherine had arranged to have installed, rang at 7:15 on a Tuesday evening. Lorraine was sitting at the table reading her father's journal by lantern light. She picked up the receiver. Mom. Mitchell's voice was careful. Controlled. The voice of a man who sold commercial real estate and understood the value of managing a conversation. Mom, I just heard some news. Lorraine waited. About the property, he continued. About what's underneath it. Silence. Mom, listen. I know things have been difficult. And I know the situation with the house and the accounts was handled in a way that might have seemed abrupt. But we were trying to protect you. We thought you might not make it, and we had to make decisions fast. Lorraine held the receiver and listened to her son construct his version of events with the same fluency he used to sell office buildings. We were scared, Mom. We didn't know what else to do. She let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then she spoke. You sold my house in 39 days, Mitchell. You emptied my savings account in 3 transactions. Craig sold Donald's truck while I was on a ventilator. Brenda took my mother's opal ring. Mitchell's voice tightened. Mom, that's not exactly how, Lorraine interrupted him gently but firmly. You divided my life among yourselves because you thought I was going to die and you wanted to get to it before the paperwork got complicated. I am not angry about that, Mitchell. I have spent too many cold nights in this house to waste energy on anger. But I am clear about what happened. And I need you to be clear about it too. Silence on the line. Then Mitchell tried again, softer now, almost plaintive. Can we come see you? Lorraine looked at the lantern flame reflected in the dark window glass. I will think about it, she said. And she hung up. Brenda called the next morning. Her approach was different, warmer, more emotional, tinged with guilt that she did not try to hide. Mom, I am so sorry. I didn't stand up when I should have. Mitchell said it was the responsible thing to do and I went along with it and I have not been able to sleep properly since I found out you were living out there alone. Lorraine listened. She did not interrupt. She did not comfort. She let Brenda say everything she needed to say, and when her daughter finally ran out of words and started crying, Lorraine said, I appreciate you calling, Brenda. 3 weeks after that phone call, Brenda drove out to Harmon Creek unannounced. Lorraine saw the car coming from the kitchen window, a silver SUV trailing dust down the dirt track, and knew who it was before it stopped. She did not go outside to greet her. She stayed at the table with a cup of tea and waited. Brenda knocked twice, then opened the door slowly, the way people enter rooms where they are not sure they are welcome. She stood in the doorway and looked at the stone walls, the wood stove, the hand pump, the narrow staircase, the single window letting in pale winter light. Her mother sat at the table in a borrowed canvas coat with a gray cat on her lap. Brenda's face crumpled. She crossed the room and knelt beside Lorraine's chair and pressed her forehead against her mother's arm and said nothing for a long time. Lorraine placed one hand on her daughter's head the way she had when Brenda was small and frightened of thunderstorms. She did not say it was all right, because it was not all right. She did not say she forgave her, because forgiveness was not something she could hand over like a gift. It was something Brenda would have to build for herself, slowly, the way Lorraine had rebuilt this house, one repair at a time. But she did not push her away. She let her daughter kneel there and cry, and she held her hand against her hair, and outside the wind moved through the valley the way it always did, steady and indifferent and vast. Craig did not call. He sent a text message to Catherine Briggs's office, asking about the legal status of the mineral rights and whether Lorraine had considered establishing a family trust. Catherine forwarded the message to Lorraine without comment. Lorraine read it once, folded the printout, and placed it in the bottom drawer of her father's filing cabinet in the underground chamber. She did not respond. The karma, when it arrived fully, did not come with a dramatic confrontation or a courtroom revelation. It came the way most justice comes, quietly, through the slow accumulation of consequence. Mitchell's commercial real estate firm had been struggling for 2 years. The fast cash from Lorraine's house sale and savings account had covered his own debts, not hers. When the mineral rights filing became public record, his business partners asked questions he could not answer comfortably. A client pulled out of a deal after learning that Mitchell had liquidated his own mother's assets while she was in intensive care. The reputation he had built on trust and professionalism developed a crack that he could not plaster over. Brenda's dental practice faced a similar ripple. She had used her share of the divided assets to renovate her office. When the story circulated through Overland Park's tight-knit professional community, patients began to leave. Not many, but enough. Enough to make Brenda sit in her renovated office surrounded by new equipment paid for with her mother's savings and understand the weight of what she had done. Craig, who had always been the quietest of the three, faced the simplest and most complete form of consequence. He had sold Donald's truck for $4,000. The truck that still smelled like his father. The truck his mother had kept in the garage for 7 years because it was the last physical space where Donald Hadley had existed. Craig had sold it to a stranger in a parking lot while his mother breathed through a machine. And now his mother was worth $100 million and had not called him, had not asked for him, had not reached out. The silence was the punishment, and it was total. But Craig also carried something the other two did not. His wife had taken Pearl to the shelter. She had called the cat a stray and walked away. When the story of Lorraine's discovery spread and the details of what each child had done became the kind of quiet currency that small towns and professional circles trade in, it was the detail about the cat that traveled farthest. Not the house, not the savings, not the truck. The cat. People could rationalize selling a house under financial pressure. They could explain away a power of attorney as a difficult decision made in difficult circumstances. But taking a 73-year-old woman's companion animal to a shelter and calling it a stray while she lay dying, that was the detail that stuck in people's throats and would not go down. Craig's wife stopped attending her book club. Then she stopped going to the grocery store on weekdays when she might run into people she knew. Craig sat alone in his living room in the evenings and understood, perhaps for the first time, that some things you do in the dark have a way of finding the light. Lorraine did not orchestrate any of this. She did not leak the story. She did not make public statements. She did not hire a publicist or call a reporter or post anything on any platform. She simply existed, quietly and stubbornly, in a stone farmhouse in a valley in western Kansas, and let the truth do what truth does when it finally reaches open air. 3 months after the survey team confirmed the deposit, Lorraine signed a mineral extraction agreement with a mid-sized mining company based in Denver. The terms were structured by Catherine Briggs to protect both the land and Lorraine's ownership. No strip mining. No surface disruption beyond a single access point. Phased extraction over 20 years with full environmental monitoring. Lorraine retained majority ownership of the mineral rights and received an upfront licensing payment of $11.3 million, with royalty payments structured quarterly based on extraction volume. She used the first payment to do 3 things. First, she established the Earl Macklin Geological Preservation Trust, a foundation dedicated to protecting significant mineral sites from exploitative extraction and funding geological education scholarships for students from rural Kansas communities. The trust was endowed with $4 million. Second, she made a donation to St. Francis Regional Medical Center in Wichita, specifically to the cardiac care unit where she had spent 41 days unconscious and alone. The donation funded a patient advocacy program designed to protect the legal and financial interests of incapacitated patients whose families might make decisions without proper oversight. The program was named the Hadley Initiative. The hospital held a small dedication ceremony. Lorraine attended, wearing the canvas coat Gwen Coulter had given her, standing in the same hallway where she had been wheeled out in a chair with a plastic bag on her lap and nowhere to go. The nurse who had welcomed her back, the young woman with kind eyes, was still working that floor. She recognized Lorraine immediately. She crossed the hallway and hugged her without a word. Lorraine held on longer than she expected to. Third, she called the rescue organization in Hutchinson. The woman who answered listened patiently while Lorraine explained who she was and described a gray tabby cat with a torn ear and a habit of sleeping on pillows. There was a long pause. Then the woman said, "Mrs. Hadley, I think I know exactly which cat you mean." Her name was still Pearl in the system. She had been fostered twice but returned both times because she refused to eat, refused to settle, spent her days sitting at windows staring at nothing, waiting for someone who never came. The rescue had considered her unadoptable. She was old. She was difficult. She was nobody's cat. Lorraine drove to Hutchinson in a truck Catherine Briggs had helped her buy, a simple used pickup, nothing fancy. When they brought Pearl out in a carrier, the cat pressed her face against the wire door and made a sound that was not quite a meow and not quite a cry. It was the sound of recognition. Lorraine opened the carrier in the front seat and Pearl climbed into her lap and did not move for the entire drive home. She did not buy a new house. She did not move back to Wichita. She stayed in the stone farmhouse her father had built, in the valley her father had protected, above the chamber her father had carved from rock and filled with the patient evidence of a lifetime. Dale Puckett helped her install a proper heating system. Gwen Coulter drove her to Topeka for the trust signing ceremony and cried in the car on the way home, though she denied it fiercely when Lorraine handed her a tissue. Dr. Marchetti returned twice to check on the extraction site and each time stayed for dinner in the farmhouse, eating soup at the wooden table while Pearl sat on the windowsill and watched the stars come out over the bluffs. One evening in late spring, nearly 8 months after Lorraine had arrived at the property with a plastic bag of old clothes and nothing else, she walked around the back of the house and stood beside the well. The iron cap had been removed permanently. The shaft was fitted now, with a proper ladder and a safety grate, but the opening remained as it had always been, a circle of hand-cut limestone descending into the earth where her father's work waited in glass jars on wooden shelves. Lorraine rested her hand on the edge of the stone. Pearl wound around her ankles, purring in that rattling, mechanical way that old cats do. The valley was quiet. The grass had turned green with the spring rains, and wildflowers dotted the hillsides in pale clusters of yellow and white. The limestone bluffs glowed amber in the low sun. Somewhere out beyond the property line, a hawk called once and went silent. Lorraine thought about the sealed well. She thought about the 55 years it had waited. She thought about her father sitting at that small desk underground, writing a letter to a daughter he would not see again, trusting that the earth would keep his secret and that one day she would come back and open what he had closed. She thought about the ICU and the 41 days and the sound of the heart monitor and the empty chair beside her bed. She thought about Mitchell and Brenda and Craig and the house on Maple Ridge Drive and the wedding china and the opal ring and the rocking chair Donald built and the truck that still smelled like him. And she thought about the fact that none of those things, not a single one, had brought her here. What brought her here was a handwritten note on brittle paper tucked inside an envelope that said, "For Lorraine. When you need it most." She had needed it most. And it had been here. Sealed and silent and waiting beneath the ground, the way only a father's love can wait, without condition, without expiration, without any expectation of return. Pearl meowed once, sharply, demanding attention or dinner or both. Lorraine smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from happiness exactly but from something deeper, a recognition that the world, for all its cruelty and carelessness, still contains hidden rooms where the things that matter most are kept safe. She looked down into the well one last time, then turned toward the house where the wood stove was burning and the lantern was lit and the evening was just beginning. The door she had opened would never be sealed again. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.